Welcome to another tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to create these nice top buttons. As you can see, at the top we have top menu with top buttons, and below we have the top contents. By default, the first tab is active and the contents of this tab is displayed. But whenever you click on any of the top buttons, you can see the contents instantly changes and it has a nice transition effect. So creating these tabs and animations are pretty simple. So let's start it. Okay, let's define the basic structure of the HTML. Title will be animated tabs. Inside the body element, we'll define a div with class equal to container. Inside the container class, we'll define a div with class equal to tabs group. Inside these, we'll define three div elements with one common class named tabs, which will be the top buttons. Copy this and paste it three more times. This one will be CSS and the third one will be JavaScript. Now let's save this. And you can see the top buttons appears. Now let's define the top contents. Inside the container class, we will define another div with class equal to contents group. Inside these, we will define three div elements with one common class name contents and one unique ID name. Inside each div element, we will have an h1 element with a title and a paragraph. Now let's copy the child div, paste it below, change the ID to content2, class name will be the same contents, title will be CSS. Paste it one more time, change the ID to content3, class name will be the same contents, and title will be JavaScript. And that's it for the HTML code. Now let's save this. So the top buttons and the top contents are there. Now let's style it with CSS. Let's define the style tags. Select all elements, margin and padding will be 0. Box sizing, border box. Target the container class. Width will be 70%. Height 350 pixels. Specify the background color for the container. Overflow will be hidden. And we will also specify the box shadow for the container. Now let's save this. You can see the container has a nice box shadow and overflow of the contents is set to hidden. Now let's center the container vertically and horizontally. Position will be absolute. Top 50%, left 50%. Transform, translate, minus 50% to the x-axis and minus 50% to the y-axis. Now let's save this, and it is perfectly centered. Now let's change the container's background color. Okay, now let's style the tabs menu. Copy the class tabs group. Display will be flex. Font weight 900. Font size 22 pixels. Border bottom will be 1 pixel solid black. Now let's style the top buttons. Target the class tabs. Padding 15 pixels to the top and bottom, 30 pixels to the left and right. Cursor pointer. And we will also specify the hover effect for the top buttons. With hover, change the background color. And we have a nice hover effect on the top buttons. Now let's style the top contents. Copy the class contents group, padding 30 pixels. Now let's style the inner contents. Target the class contents. Position will be absolute. Specify the color. Width will be 100% minus 60 pixels. 30 pixels plus 30 pixel padding is equal to 60 pixels. Let's save this. Now let's style the headings and the paragraph tags. Target the H1 element, padding bottom 26 pixels. Target the paragraph tag, font size 20 pixels. Okay, now we need to hide the contents. To do so, we will use the transform translate property to shift the contents to the right side. So let's go back to the code editor. Inside the class contents, we will add transform translate x 105%. You can see all the contents are hidden. Now we want the first top button HTML to be active by default and the contents of the HTML tab should be displayed. So let's go back to the HTML code. We will add a class name active to the first div element with id name equal to content1. And we will also add an active class to the first div element inside the tabs group. Now let's copy the class contents group and target the active class inside it. Transform translate x 0%. Now copy the class name tabs group and target the active class inside the tabs group and specify the background color. And you can see the HTML contents are displayed, but the first tab button is not active. So let's have a look at the code to find the error. Okay, we misspelled the class name. And there it is. Now let's add JavaScript code so that we can switch between the tabs, and whenever we click on any of the tab button, the contents of that tab should display. Now inside the first tab button, we will add a click event which will call a function called openTab. Inside the parentheses, we will pass two arguments, this which represents the same element and the id name of the first div element called content1. Now copy this and paste it in the second tab button. Here we will pass the id name of the second div element called content2. Similarly, paste it in the third tab button, and here we will pass the id name of the third div element called content3. Now let's provide definition for the function. Let's define the script tags. Inside the parentheses, we will pass two parameters, current tab which will store the value of this and current content which will store the id names passed in the call function. Let's define a variable all tabs which will store all the tab buttons. Let's define another variable, all content, which will store all top contents. And one more variable, current content, which will store the ID name of the active top contents. Now we will define a for loop and we will loop through all the top buttons and all the top contents. This line will remove the active class from the top buttons. And the second line will remove the active class from the top contents. Now let's add active class to the current top button on which we click, and we will also add active class to the current top contents. Now let's add a transition so that the top contents will be changing smoothly. We will scroll up and inside the class contents we will add transition transform 0.3 seconds is out. Okay, we will also add transition to the active class. So let's go back to the code editor. Now in the active class inside the contents group, we will add transition transform 0.3 seconds, transition delay 0.4 seconds. And now we have a nice transition effect while switching between the tabs. So that's it for this tutorial, and I hope this class will be helpful for you.